The first time I walked into the Norfolk Veterans Center that spring morning, I didn't plan on talking to anyone. I just wanted coffee. Cheap, bitter, and strong enough to remind me I was still alive. The kind of coffee we used to drink before dawn, back when the world was louder and I was half the man I am now. The place smelled like old wood and disinfectant. A television murmured some news about politics no one cared about. A few young recruits waited near the front desk, their uniforms crisp, their eyes restless. They looked through me like I was another framed photograph on the wall, another piece of the past. I'd gotten used to that look over the years. The one that says, "Thank you for your service," but really means, "You don't belong here anymore." I was pouring my coffee when a voice behind me cut through the quiet. A young officer, sharp haircut, shiny insignia, not a scar on him, laughed and said something about old-timers taking up space. I didn't bother turning around at first. You learn not to feed the arrogance of youth. But then he called me Grandpa and told me this area was for active personnel only. I turned, slowly, not out of anger, but because it takes me longer these days. He stood there, Lieutenant Commander Blake Harris, the kind of man who thinks medals come from PowerPoint presentations and not blood. I could see in his face that he didn't recognize me, not that I expected him to. I just nodded and said, "You're right, son. These aren't my days anymore." Then I set my cup down, straightened my back out of old habit, and started toward the door. That should have been the end of it. But fate, she's got a strange sense of timing. As I reached for the handle, a voice stopped me. A deep, steady voice I hadn't heard in almost 50 years. Hank Malone. For a moment I thought I was hallucinating. My hands froze midair. When I turned, I saw him standing there. Rear Admiral Douglas Ford. Older, slower, but still carrying that same weight of command in his shoulders. He looked at me like he'd just seen a ghost. Maybe he had. Everyone in the room fell silent. Even the TV went quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. He walked toward me, studying my face. "You're alive," he whispered. "After all this time." I just nodded. What was I supposed to say? He put a hand on my shoulder, and I saw the flicker of memory in his eyes. Vietnam, 1972, the fire, the screaming, the night we thought would never end. That's when Harris spoke again, sounding smaller than before. "You know this man, sir?" Ford turned to him slowly. The room could have frozen solid in that moment. "Know him," he said. "Lieutenant, this man saved my entire team. If not for him, I'd be a name carved in stone." I didn't need the applause that followed. I never did. I'd spent half a century trying not to be remembered. But hearing Ford's voice again cracked something open, inside me. Something I'd buried under silence, guilt, and the slow crawl of time. He noticed the small tattoo on my neck, half hidden by the collar of my jacket. Ghost 5. He smiled, but there was pain in that smile. "You never told anyone you survived." And I told him the truth. There was no reason to. After what we did out there, peace was the only reward worth keeping. Ford asked me to attend a memorial at Little Creek that Friday. The invitation arrived like a summons from a past life. I kept it on the kitchen table for 2 days, moving it from one corner to the other, pretending I hadn't already decided. I never liked ceremonies. They ask you to stand inside a spotlight, while the worst parts of your memory pace just outside it. But the men we lost didn't get to choose their endings. The least I could do was show up for theirs. The base hadn't changed much. Fresh paint on old bones. Young faces in crisp uniforms that still had the price tags hanging off the courage. I walked in alone, carrying only a worn metal dog tag in my pocket. It rattled against the keys like it had something left to say. The auditorium was half shadows, half flags. A large screen flickered with black and white photos. Names scrolled in neat rows, the way bureaucracies try to make grief look organized. I found a seat along the aisle, two-thirds back, a place designed for leaving quietly if the ghosts grew too loud. They started with an anthem and the kind of prayer that tries not to offend anyone, and therefore misses the people who most need it. Then, the lights shifted, and Ford took the stage. He didn't wear his medals. He didn't have to. The room recognized the weight of his years and stood straight without being told. He spoke about an operation that had lived under lock and key for half a century, Echo Dagger, a mission that went wrong in all the predictable and unforgivable ways. Bad intel, bad weather, bad timing, men pinned in a mangrove labyrinth while the world pretended the map was accurate. The slide changed and young faces looked down on us, their eyes bright with the lie of invincibility. I recognized four. I recognized the dirt under their fingernails, the way they held their shoulders like the future was a rucksack they'd trained to carry. Ford's voice thinned for one sentence, and then came back tempered. He said the extraction was denied. He said the clock ran out. He said the report used the word unrecoverable. Somewhere in the rows ahead of me, a chair creaked. Someone's grief shifted position to keep the blood flowing. Then Ford did the thing that ceremonies promise, but rarely deliver. He told the truth, without varnish. He said one man went back after the clock ran out. No radio, no promise of a ride home. No permission except the kind a body grants itself when the heart refuses to leave without the ones it came with. He said that man found 5 survivors, where the paperwork had listed none. He threaded them through darkness and water, until the sound of rotors grew from rumor to fact. Ford paused there, letting the silence be the witness. Then he said the name I had spent 50 years misplacing inside myself. Henry Malone, Ghost 5. I didn't stand. The room did it for me. Hands met hands. Some salutes snapped like ice breaking on a winter river. I kept my eyes on the floor and let the noise pass over. Praise is a kind of weather. It never lasts long enough to change the season. When it was over, people moved the way people always do when a ceremony ends, hesitant, looking for the correct expression to wear home. A few approached me to say the sentences they were supposed to say. I thanked them like a man taking a receipt he never plans to use. Harris lingered at the edge of the aisle, his face unsteady in a way that made him look younger than the fabric on his shoulders. He tried to speak, failed, tried again. I spared him the humiliation of arranging apologies in public. I told him to save the respect for the ones who were still learning how to carry it. A reception followed in a room with glass walls that made the afternoon look gentler than it was. Trays circled, coffee steamed, old stories walked with canes. I drifted toward the back, where a memorial wall had been mounted, black granite thinned to 2 dimensions, thick with meaning anyway. I let my fingers travel down the cold names until they stopped at a familiar mistake. Lieutenant Commander Douglas Ford, presumed KIA, 1972. I almost laughed. Bureaucracy had made him a ghost to keep the paperwork tidy. Life had reversed the punctuation. He joined me there, silent at first, the way soldiers greet each other when words would be an intrusion. He stood close enough that I could hear the small sounds people make when they're holding a posture for too long. We both read the same line again, the same incorrect death packaged as certainty. He said irony, and I said nothing because irony is a word for people who haven't run out of adjectives yet. Reporters wanted a quote. I gave them coordinates instead, names of men whose families deserved a phone call more than the public deserved a headline. The base PA system crackled with instructions that no one needed. Somewhere in the building, a flag was being folded into a triangle that would live on a mantle beside a bowl for spare change. Back in the hall, a short film played. Archival footage, grainy and indecent. The past refusing to wear makeup. A helicopter hovered inches above a river that had already decided what it wanted to swallow. The camera shook. Someone off-screen yelled the universal sentence, "Go, go, go." A figure lunged through the frame, carrying another man like a bundle of wet rope. You couldn't see faces. You could see intent. When the screen went black, the lights stayed down a moment longer than comfortable. The audience breathed as one organism. Then a switch clicked, and the room returned to its ordinary shape, like a body adjusting after a long-held note. We shook hands with the living. We nodded toward the dead. Harris worked his way to me again, this time without the armor of indignation. He asked how I had known what to do. I told him the answer none of us want. You don't know, you decide. You make a choice that will afterward be called courage or foolishness depending on whether it works. You make it anyway because the alternative is to become a man who left 5 names on a wall he could have kept off it. He asked about the tattoo. I told him we marked ourselves back then because the paperwork insisted we didn't exist. Ghost Unit, Ghost 5. He said it sounded romantic. I told him romance is what the living use to make sense of what almost killed them. A chaplain with eyes like rain came over to thank me on behalf of families who had sent letters to the unit for years without answers. I wrote my number on a napkin and told him to give it to any name that still needed a voice on the other end at 2 in the morning. The napkin shook in his hand. He slid it into a pocket like a relic and left before gratitude turned into tears in a room not built for them. Out on the steps, the wind coming off the water had the taste of rust and salt. The world always smells the same on bases. Fuel, fresh paint, the faint chemical of cleaning products, scrubbing at guilt. I stood there long enough for the traffic to settle and let my heart step down from parade rest. Ford found me again and said there was more work to do and less time to do it in. He meant the living. He meant the men who had made it home but never arrived. He asked whether I would help him build something that would catch those who fall between the cracks. Nobody admits are load-bearing. I said I was tired. He said so am I. Sometimes that's the correct password. I returned to the center the next day, not as a ghost but as a man, wearing his years on the outside. Harris nodded at me when I passed him, and in that nod I heard the faintest click of humility locking into place. I poured coffee for a kid whose hands shook too badly to do it himself. I showed him the trick of bracing the styrofoam with a thumb under the lip so it wouldn't cave. Small victories are still victories. The center's bulletin board had a flyer about a support group with a bad title and a worse time slot. I took a pen and crossed out the title. I wrote the words, "We need a better name," and slid the pen back into the tray. I imagined a room where the first rule was that no one had to earn the right to speak. I imagined showing up on a Tuesday and staying until somebody remembered why they'd come. I imagined telling them that the bravest thing I ever did was leave the uniform on a chair and learn the names of my neighbors. I slept that night without seeing the river turn black. In the morning, I woke to an ordinary sun and a note under my door. Ford's handwriting again. Steady as a compass even now. He'd secured a small grant for a pilot program. He asked me to lead it, unofficial and unadorned, at the Norfolk Center for 3 months. No press, no podiums, just chairs in a circle and coffee that never runs out. I traced the ink with my thumb and felt the strange lightness that comes when a mission arrives without a gun. On the way to the center, I passed a school where kids were raising a flag with the anarchic choreography only children manage. It snagged, their faces crumpled. A teacher intervened with the gentle competence that keeps the country running. The cloth climbed again, found its breeze, did what it was meant to do. I took that as an omen without asking permission. The first night I unlocked the multi-purpose room and turned on exactly half the lights. Men arrived in 2s and 3s, suspicious of themselves, suspicious of me. I told them we would not talk about battles unless the battle they meant was the one with the empty chair at the kitchen table, the one with a bottle cap, the one with a silence that stays even when the TV is loud. We spoke in sentences that didn't need rank to stand upright. We stayed until the custodian coughed the universal signal for closing time. We left as if we hadn't done anything worth naming. We had. I paid for donuts the second week and pretended someone else had. Harris appeared in the doorway and didn't come in. I waved him in anyway. He sat without making a speech. That was his best choice of the evening. When he finally spoke, he didn't use the words I expected. He asked how to apologize without making the apology, another way of talking about himself. I told him he just did. Ford visited once and stood in the back where the shadows are wide enough to hide pride. He left before the end, the way men do when they're trying not to own a thing they believe should belong to the people it's saving. At home that weekend, I set the dog tag on the table and said a few names out loud. The house didn't answer. Houses never do. But the quiet felt less like a verdict and more like a place to rest between shifts. I realized I was ready for part 3 of a life I never expected to have. The part where usefulness replaces glory, where an old call sign becomes a phone number someone can dial when the night crowds in. I ironed a clean shirt for Monday. Old habits, new use. The tag went back into my pocket. It barely rattled this time. It knew the route. The Monday that followed felt quieter than most. Maybe it was me. Maybe the world was just tired of pretending it owed me noise. The Veterans Center was half empty, chairs still slightly out of line from our last meeting. I straightened them out, the way a man might polish old metals, out of habit more than purpose. The walls had that institutional beige color that tries to comfort you and fails. Still, it was the only place in town where I didn't feel invisible. By the third week, the group had started to look less like strangers and more like men remembering how to breathe. One of them, Eddie, had been a Marine sniper back in Fallujah. His laugh was still the loudest in the room, but now it came with pauses. Another, named Tom, had survived a helicopter crash in Afghanistan and still flinched every time a door slammed. No one asked him about it. We just made sure to close doors slowly. That was the rule. Respect before curiosity. Even Harris started coming more regularly. The first time, he just listened, sitting at the edge of the circle like he was guarding the perimeter. The second week, he brought coffee for everyone. And the third, he said something that made the whole room go quiet. "I thought heroism meant medals," he said. "Turns out it's just showing up even when you don't have to." No one applauded, but that was because applause would have ruined it. After the meeting, I found him by the vending machine, the same one where we'd first crossed paths months earlier. He looked different, less steel in his shoulders, more weight in his eyes. "I didn't know how to look you in the eye before," he told me. "Now I don't know how to stop." I told him what Ford once told me back in the jungle. You earn respect by surviving in a way that leaves room for others. He nodded, like he finally understood. That evening, when everyone had gone home, I stayed behind to lock up. The corridor lights buzzed with the lazy rhythm of tired electricity. On my way out, I saw the flyer for the memorial fund Ford had started. Echo's initiative for those still fighting. His signature was at the bottom, but my name wasn't anywhere. That was on purpose. I didn't need it there. 2 days later, he called. "Got a minute, Ghost 5?" he said, using the old name with the same smirk it used to carry. "Depends," I replied. "You buying lunch?" "Better," he said. "I'm buying trouble." We met at a small diner near the harbor, one of those places that smells like bacon grease and old promises. He walked in wearing civilian clothes but still stood like a man expecting inspection. The waitress brought him black coffee without asking. Habit or history, I couldn't tell which. He told me the Navy was launching a new program pairing retired veterans with younger officers. "They're calling it Crosstide," he said. "Mentorship with teeth." Then he looked straight at me. "I want you to lead the first unit," I laughed. "You want the guy who quit 50 years ago to teach loyalty?" He smiled. "You didn't quit, Hank. You just stopped saluting lies. That one hit harder than I expected. I stared at the chipped mug in front of me, tracing a crack that ran straight down the middle. "You ever wonder," I asked, "why it's easier to face gunfire than kindness?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "Because one ends quicker." We didn't talk much after that. Didn't have to. The silence said everything, the kind that grows between men who've both lived long enough to outlast their own definitions. When we stepped outside, the sun was starting to sink over the bay, turning the water into a sheet of copper. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and familiar. Ford pulled something from his pocket, a small box wrapped in cloth. "Thought this belonged to you," he said. Inside was a worn metal pin, shaped like a trident. It had been mine once, back before I stopped believing that symbols could carry weight. I held it in my palm, feeling its cold edge, and for the first time in decades, it didn't feel heavy. "Keep it," I told him. He shook his head. "You earned it more than I did." I looked at him and said, "That's not the point, Doug. You carried the name. I carried the ghosts. Seems fair we split the burden." He laughed, a quiet sound like sandpaper on wood. "You always were stubborn." "Still am," I said. The next morning, I went to the center early. The sunrise painted the hallway in gold, and for a moment I thought of the river back in '72, the smell of diesel, the rhythm of the chopper blades, the way survival sounded like breathing through someone else's panic. Funny how memory sneaks up on you when you least expect it. Harris came in later, bringing a small box of medals. "Some of the guys didn't want these anymore," he said. "They figured maybe the new generation should earn their own." He set the box down and looked at me. "What should I do with them?" I told him to melt them down and make something useful. Maybe a bench out front, a place where old men could sit and remember without ceremony. He smiled. "That's not regulation." "Neither are we," I said. That evening, Ford stopped by unannounced. His suit was rumpled, his eyes red around the edges, like he'd been reading too many files about too many men who'd fallen through the cracks. He told me the government had approved the pilot for Crosstide. He said it would need someone to write the manual, someone who understood what the real battlefield looked like when the shooting stopped. I told him I'd write it, but only under one condition: no rank, no politics, and no speeches. He agreed without hesitation. Before he left, he looked around the room, at the mismatched chairs, the cheap coffee, the peeling paint. "You know," he said, "this place could use a new coat." "Leave it," I replied. "It's earned its scars." He gave me a long look, half admiration, half concern, and said, "You know, Hank, I think you might outlive us all." "Only if I'm lucky," I said. He left after that. I watched his car disappear down the street and realized something I hadn't before. Surviving wasn't the same as living. But maybe, just maybe, one could lead to the other. That night, I sat by the window with the trident pin still in my hand. Outside, the city lights blurred against the water. I thought of all the faces that never got to grow old, of the laughter that turned into echoes. Then I pinned the trident to the bulletin board by the door. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Not all ghosts are dead. Some of us just learned how to keep breathing. The week before Crosstide launched, I found an envelope slid under the door of the multi-purpose room. No return address, just my name written in a hand that had learned patience the hard way. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed at the edges, folded twice with the care people reserve for things they intend to outlive them. A post-it was stuck to the top, Ford's tidy script. "He left this with the chaplain in '72 in case you ever surfaced. I never knew whether to send it. I figured you'd tell me when." The letter was from Mason Hale. He was the quietest man in our unit, and the one who could make a radio sing through a monsoon. He didn't make it out. I braced myself for the familiar blow that comes when the dead speak in the present tense, and started reading. Hank, if this finds you, it means two miracles happened. You lived and someone kept a promise. I don't have a sermon for you. You already know what we did and why we did it. But I want you to hear this from someone who won't be around to argue back. You were the only one of us who made choices without asking permission from ghosts that weren't even dead yet. If you walked away after, good. Somebody had to carry the memory into a kind of life where it could be useful. If anybody calls it running, let them run farther than you did and come back with 5 men. If you ever get tired, and you will, find a room where the chairs are in a circle and the coffee is bad. Sit there until someone else remembers how to talk. Then get out of the way. That's the job. That's always been the job. Tell Ford he doesn't owe me a flag. He owes the next kid a chance. Mason. I read it twice, then a third time. Then felt the strange relief of instruction. I'd spent 50 years improvising a penance that didn't have a name. Mason gave it one that fit in a human day. I brought the letter to the next group. I didn't read it out loud. I placed it in the center of the circle and told the men what it said in the language of now. No mythology, no music under the words. Just the simple fact that the living are the delivery system for promises the dead can't keep anymore. Harris sat forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands tented under his chin, as if prayer might be a posture you can learn by accident. Crosstide began with no ceremony. That was on purpose. We had 8 officers and 8 retirees, and the pairing looked like a joke until it didn't. We met twice a week. The only rule was that rank stopped at the threshold. The only curriculum was accumulated weather. What a kitchen sounds like at 3 in the morning when you can't talk yourself back into your own bed. How to apologize to a daughter without drafting terms and conditions. What the first 24 hours after a funeral do to the idea of invincibility you carried like spare change. Harris volunteered for the hard pair, a kid named Ortiz, who wore his jaw like a shield and had translated every feeling he'd ever had into sarcasm. The first night Harris told him about the vending machine moment, the mistaken pride, and the long walk toward humility. I thought respect was a mirror, he said. Turns out it's a door. Ortiz didn't answer, but he came back on Thursday and brought 2 coffees. I counted that as a signature on a contract neither of them would ever write. Ford kept his promise and stayed out of the way. He visited once, shook hands like a man measuring pulse, and slipped back into the current of work. When the first month ended, he sent exactly 1 note. No headlines. Good. Keep going. We kept going. On a wet Tuesday, I took the box of unclaimed medals Harris had collected and drove them to a metalworker in a garage that didn't advertise a sign. He was the kind of craftsman who saved dents on purpose. I asked him to melt the ribbons and brass into something that wouldn't need polishing. He asked what I had in mind. I said a bench, a seat that could carry more weight than its dimensions suggest. He nodded the way men nod when something practical and holy lands in the room. 2 weeks later, he called to say it was ready. We set it outside the center, between the flagpole and the place where the smokers stand when the weather is pretending to be kind. The bench looked ordinary from a distance and inevitable up close. If you knew what it was made of, you couldn't sit without feeling the heat of history through your jeans. I watched a young recruit take his lunch out there the first afternoon, unwrap a sandwich and read a letter with the kind of attention that makes both the writer and the reader better. He didn't know I was watching. That made it work. One of the older men, Eddie, brought his grandson to a session. The boy had that familiar combination of curiosity and caution, the look of someone deciding whether the world is safe enough to keep looking at directly. He sat beside the coffee urn and didn't fidget. At the end, he asked if the trident on the bulletin board was mine. I told him it belonged to the room. He said that made sense. He was 10 and already smarter than the language adults use to justify hoarding. In late autumn, The center asked if we'd close the quarter with a public talk. Nothing showy, just a microphone, some chairs, and whoever wanted to listen. I said yes on one condition, that the first voice be someone who had learned to stay, rather than someone who had learned to speak. Harris suggested Ortiz. I agreed, as long as he went first. He grimaced, then laughed at his own grimace, then said all right. We kept the lights low and the duration shorter than the appetite in the room. Harris told the story of disrespect, with the clarity of a man who now recognized how small it made him. Ortiz spoke about a night he sat in a parked car outside his apartment, rehearsing an apology until the engine ticked cold. I read Mason's letter, just the middle part, and watched the temperature of the silence change when I reached the line about the bad coffee and the circle of chairs. The custodian stood in the doorway with his arms folded, pretending to be grumpy about overtime. He didn't fool anyone. After the talk, a woman in her 70s approached with a photograph pressed flat by decades in a frame. Her husband had been listed MIA in '72. She pointed to the corner of the picture where a shadow could be a man and a smudge could be a smile, and asked whether I thought it was him. I told her the truth. I didn't know. Then I told her another truth. Sometimes certainty is a luxury grief can't afford. She nodded and thanked me for saying it plain. We sat on the metal bench and watched the flag find its wind. She told me she had finally stopped setting an extra plate at Thanksgiving. We agreed that letting go didn't mean letting down. That winter, I finally visited the memorial wall alone, without an audience at my shoulder. Snow had been a rumor, more than a fact that season, but a skin of frost sketched the black granite in a way that made the names look engraved on glass. I pressed my palm against Mason's and let my breath fog the space until the letters blurred into a single shape. I didn't say his name. I didn't need to. Names are for calling across distance. He felt close. When I turned to go, Ford was there, hands in his coat pockets, hat jammed down against a wind that hadn't decided what kind of day it wanted. He asked if I'd gotten the letter. I told him I had, and that he'd been right to wait. He said the chaplain who'd stored it had died the year before, still faithful to a promise he hadn't made to either of us. We stood there, two old men with repaired knees and unrepairable memories, and counted the ways a country stays together by accident and on purpose. I think we're done with the pilot, he said. I think it's time to make it ordinary. Ordinary is the highest honor a good idea can earn, I said. We walked back without filling the space between us with anything careless. The bench caught the sun and gave it back, small and steady. The last meeting of the year fell on a night the sky decided to get serious about winter. The men showed up anyway. That's how I knew it mattered. We pushed the chairs a little closer. We kept our coats on and held the coffee like a committee of candles. I told them I wanted to end with something that didn't sound like an ending. I told them about the day I first put the call sign on my skin and the day I stopped answering to it. I told them what Mason had asked me to do and what we had done together because of it. I told them the simplest truth I know. Dignity is the opposite of spectacle. When everyone left, I stayed to turn off the lights. The room looked bigger in the half-dark. I pinned a photocopy of Mason's letter next to the trident and wrote under it in block letters, "Open late, always open late." I locked the door and put my ear to the wood for a second like a fool listening for a heartbeat. I heard the building creak, the heater cough, a distant laugh echo down the hall. It was enough. On the way home, I detoured past the pier where the harbor keeps its secrets in plain view. The wind peeled heat off my skin. I took the dog tag from my pocket and rolled it across my knuckles, the way I used to do with coins when I wanted to look harmless. The tag had taken on the temperature of my palm. I recognized the weight of it not as guilt anymore, but as geometry, a proof that certain lines still connect. At my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with the light off and listened to the neighbor's radio bleed a Motown station through thin walls. I counted backwards from 10, the way the corpsman taught me to do, when the morphine wouldn't arrive in time. At 1, I realized I was smiling. It startled me so much I said Mason's name out loud to see if the spell would break. It didn't. Spring arrived without asking permission. The tulip magnolias tried again. The center painted over exactly one section of scuffed wall. And I hated the decision until I noticed how the clean patch made the rest honest. Harris got orders to a training command and asked whether it would be cowardly to turn them down. I told him it would be cowardly not to ask the question, and brave to answer it without checking to see who was watching. He accepted the posting, and sent word that Ortiz had called him twice the first week. Twice is a life raft, not a habit. That's all you can ask. On the first anniversary of Crosstide, we didn't celebrate. We did inventory. Who was still coming? Who had slipped away? Who needed a phone call and who needed a ride? We added a small line at the bottom of the sign-in sheet. Who do you trust at 2 a.m.? The answers weren't poetic. They were names. That's how I knew we were winning. Ford insisted on one photograph. He said donors like receipts. We took it outside on a day the sky looked like a fresh coat of courage. No uniforms, no salutes. Just men and women dressed like the plans they had after the meeting. He stood off to the side, and then stepped out of the frame altogether. When the picture came back, I pinned it under the trident and the letter, and suddenly the bulletin board looked like a map. I am not naive enough to call this a happy ending. Most endings don't care what we call them. But I have learned the habit of gratitude, the way a man learns which knee will complain first. I'm grateful for the bench that holds strangers while they decide if they're going to keep going. I'm grateful for the bad coffee that tastes like staying. I'm grateful for the letter that arrived late enough to be right on time. If you ask me now about Ghost 5, I'll tell you it was a useful rumor. It got men moving when the radios went dumb. It paid for 5 lives, with one more still trying to find the cash register. But the name I answer to these days is just Hank. It's the one a kid says when he's asking whether he can borrow the key to the supply closet. It's the one the receptionist uses when a caller won't leave a number but needs a call back anyway. It's the one Ford uses when he wants me to say no to something on his behalf and make it sound like wisdom. I keep Mason's original letter in a plastic sleeve because paper is mortal. I keep a copy in my wallet because men are too. I keep a third copy tucked under the cushion of the metal bench, taped to the underside where only the curious will find it. It's good to reward curiosity when it bends down. Sometimes, walking home, I take the long way past the water. The harbor is a quieter river, but it argues with the same logic. It tells you everything is moving even when you can't see the motion. It tells you that a wake looks like a scar until it smooths out and reveals it was just a record of direction. It tells you to choose your heading and forgive the tide for not caring. On a night when the wind came in clean off the bay, I stopped at the end of the pier and took a breath I didn't know I'd been saving. I thought of all the men who never had the chance to grow old enough to be mistaken for unimportant, and I blessed the indignity of survival because it let me hold that thought. I touched the tattoo on my neck, like a man turning off a light in a room that no longer needs it. The skin is thin there. The past is too. Sometimes that's mercy. On the bulletin board the next morning, someone had written in small, neat letters under the photo, "We are not finished." No signature, no need. I left it there. I replaced the coffee filter. I unlocked the door. The room filled the way it always does. Slowly, then all at once. Chairs scraped, laughter stuttered, and then settled into a hum. The bench outside caught the sun and did its work. If you're looking for a moral, you won't find it here. We don't do morals in these rooms. We do mornings. We do minutes. We do the ordinary heroism of not leaving. We do the miracle Mason asked for, the bad coffee and the circle of chairs. We do the one job that never ends. We show up.